Howdy folks, this is Brian Grant with CSG Pro here in beautiful Portland, Oregon, and today we're going to be talking about context transition inside of DAX. And we're not just going to be talking about it, we're going to be showing it to you because this is a visual guide to context transition. So let's go ahead and get started. To begin, we're going to start with an empty blank slate and a very simple data model. Okay, so here's the data model we're going to be working with today. We've got a sale table, we've got a customer table. In the sales table, we've got the sale amount and the name of the person that we sold it to. In the customer table, we've got, again, the name and the country that each one of these people is associated with, right? And notice we've sort of prefixed each one of these column names with the actual table name. It's sort of a fully qualified table name, if you will. That's going to make things a little bit easier to read as we move forward. Okay, so in addition to these two tables, I'm also going to show the expanded sales table. If you've watched my my video on row context versus filter context, this is going to make a whole lot more sense. But suffice to say, whenever you call a table inside a DAX in a DAX expression, you don't actually get the regular old table. You get the expanded version of that table, right? And so for the sale table, because it's got this customer table that's on the one side of a one-to-many relationship, this is sort of like a lookup table, and all the columns in that lookup table get brought in to the expanded version of that table. So notice here we've got sale amount and sale name, sale amount, sale name. We've also got the customer name and the customer country, right? Customer name and customer country. These are identical. I guess I could have left one of these out, but just to make it a little easier to understand, just remember that we bring in all the tables from sort of the upstream, or all the columns from the upstream table. Okay, so what about the expanded version of the customers table? Well, we're going to need that too, but I'm kind of short on space, and if you'll notice, there's no additional customer type or anything like that. There's no additional lookup tables for the customers table, so the regular version of the customers table is actually the exact same thing as the expanded version of it. So this is sort of going to act as both, okay? So now that we've got those, let's go ahead and look at our pivot table. So what we're trying to get at is sales for our top customer, and we have two countries, Canada and USA, and we've got two measures, the bad one and the good one. Notice the bad measure is always returning the number 23, which is not correct. The good one, by contrast, is returning the correct number, our sales for our top customer. So what is the difference between these two measures? Well, let's go look at the DAX behind them. So we've got the bad measure and the good measure, and it's a pretty simple expression. We've got a max X of the customers table, so hey, go get the customers table, and for each one of the rows in it, go get basically the total sales for each one of those customers, and then take the max of that. So go get all the customer sales and bring back the biggest number. And you would think that would work, but it doesn't. It doesn't work here, but it does work over here. And the only difference between this and this is for argument 2 here, we've basically got this exact same expression, but we wrap it, right, inside of a calculate, right? So this part here is exactly the same as this part, but it's surrounded by this calculate. And what that calculate is going to do is it's going to force what's called context transition, which is going to make all of this work. So let's see, we've got that. To make things a little easier, whenever we've got a table call, right, it's going to be sort of this yellow color here. Sale refers to this beige color right here, right? So whenever you see sale, it's going to refer to that table right there. Whenever we go call a table, it's going to go grab that. And for the customers, we're going to have sort of this blue color right here. So customer, whenever you call the customer table, you're sort of calling the expanded version of the customer table, which is this right here. Okay. So let's grab a definition. Context transition. What is it? Well, without asking, calculate adds whatever's in the current row context to the current filter context. That's it. It's just that simple. Now, if you're not sort of a DAX expert, you can look at that and say, all right, I see that, the sentences aren't very complex, but I have no idea what that means, or I have a very vague idea what that means, and I don't really see how it's going to play out and help us in these examples. Well, we're going to walk through these guys, and hopefully when you see us walking through sort of what actually happens in these expressions, it's going to make this context transition thing make a whole lot more sense. So this abstract definition is going to be hopefully crystal clear by the end of this video. So let's go ahead and look at the bad formula, okay? So the bad formula, I'm going to get rid of that there just so we can just look at the bad formula. Before it does anything else, it's going to grab the customers table and it's going to add a column to it, and this is going to be the column it adds to it and then takes the max of that column. So we're going to start by grabbing the customers table. But to grab a table, whenever we grab a table, we're going to grab the expanded version of it, seen through the lens of the current filter context. So what is the current filter context? Well, we're looking at this cell right here, right? And in that cell, USA is sort of here on rows, so we're going to have for a customer country equals USA. That's going to be part of the filter context. So whenever we start our evaluation, whatever here is on rows or on columns or stuff like that, that's going to populate our filter context. So we've only got one thing, customer country equals USA. So that gets added to our filter context right off the bat, okay? So when we grab our customers table, it's going to be seen through the lens of this. So let's think about, say we go grab a customer table, and we say, okay, we're going to grab expand the version of the customers table, but first we have to apply the filter. So the filter is customer country equals USA. Well, there's customer country is USA. So here's all the values where it equals USA. So we want all the rows that pass all of our tests. Well, there's only one test, so we're going to grab all the USA rows. Exactly what we want. Great. Now we've got a table of customers that are just the USA customers. Fantastic. Next thing we're going to do, now that we've grabbed that table, we're going to add a column to it, and that column is going to have this definition right there, right? So max x adds a column, and then takes the max value of it. So first we got to add that column. So let's add the x column, right? Then we're going to take the max of it. But wait, what is the x column? Well, the x column is just this expression right there, right? Same thing as that expression right there. So we're going to have to cell by cell or row by row sort of populate each one of these values using this expression, okay? And if you'll notice, this expression actually makes a separate table call, right? So it's not just sort of pointing at a different value here in the current row. It's actually going to go call out a whole new table. So we're going to need some space to sort of show you how this works. So let's think about, we're going to do this 3 times. So here's where all of our sort of stuff's going to be. Let's start by thinking about, here, this first value right there. So when we evaluate this sort of cell right here, it's going to be evaluated in this row context because we're sort of in the current row. Row context isn't exactly the same thing as the current row, but it's pretty close, and I think if you're starting out, that's a great way to think about it. So we're going to say, okay, we want to grab this value. So we're going to say, all right, go get the sales table, add this column to it, and sum it all up. Fantastic. So we're going to grab the sales table, right? But before we do anything else, we have to think about the filter context. Well, the filter context starts by being populated with customer country equals USA. And you might think that the customer name equals AN is sort of in there too, but it's not, because that's not part of the filter context. That's part of this row context, the green thing right here. That actually doesn't affect the filter context unless we sort of force it to. So what that means is, because it's not part of the filter context, when we go to grab the sales table, when we go to grab the sale table, this one right here, we're only going to be looking at it through the lens of this filter context, which doesn't have anything about AN in there. So, again, we say customer country is the column we're filtering. Well, there's customer country. The value we want is USA. Well, there's all the rows where it equals USA. So we want those rows right there, and we bring those down, right? And notice, this is not all of the sales for USA and AN. This is just sales for USA. And as you may be seeing, that's immediately going to give us a big problem. Okay, so let's keep walking through this. So we've gotten our sale table. Now we need to add a column to it because this is some X, so add a column. Then that column is going to be sale amount plus 0. So we're going to add a column. Column is going to be defined as sale amount plus 0. And the sum is going to be, when we're all done with this column, we're going to sum up the results. So let's step through this. Okay, so for sort of cell, if you want to think about it as a cell 1 here, we're going to get the sale amount plus 0. Because we're in a row context, sale amount refers to just this sale amount, not the entire column. So we could say 8 plus 0 equals 8. Fantastic, okay? So in this row context for this cell, 4 plus 0 equals 4. Well, okay, here in this row context, 5 plus 0 equals 5, and 6 plus 0 equals 6. And the grand total for that is going to be, when we sum it all up, because that's what we do with this x column in sum x, we get 23. And we're going to take that 23 and bring it back there. Okay, there's 23. And we can immediately see that 23 is not the sales for AN in the USA, so we already have a problem. And what we'll see is if we go ahead and move on to the next row in this table, we go ahead and start doing the same thing. We consider the filter context. Once again, since Han is part of the row context, not the filter context, it doesn't get added here to the filter context unless we force it to, and we don't. So when we go and we get the sales table, we're going to get the exact same thing we had up here, which is just the USA sales. So we're going to get those rows, bring those back, and just like before, since it's the exact same formula, we're going to step through and get the exact same results, right? So here's, we can very clearly see our problem emerging, right? we're not getting, for each one of these customers, we're not getting total sales for that customer. We're just getting total sales for USA, which isn't what we want at all. And again, so 23 goes back there. And if we do it for the last one, once again, consider the filter context. It's just equal USA. Jorge doesn't get added to it because we haven't forced to be added to it using context transition. So what we end up with is the same exact table. Boom, boom, boom. And we get the same exact results for that table, and we're going to get the same 23 value that we had before, right? So the sum of that column is 23, and we get 23 there. So now that we've got our X column calculated, which we can already see is incorrect, if we take the max of that, well, they're all 23s. The max of that is just 23. And that is what populates that right there. Boom, just like that. So that's where that wrong answer comes from, and that's why it's wrong. Because even though we're calling the sales table kind of here within each one of these rows, because we don't sort of promote the row context to filter context or transition the filter context to the row context to filter context, it doesn't actually affect the sales calls. And so because of that, we get the same sales table, and when we add up the sales for that table, well, we get the same number each time. That's why that is not working. So let's contrast. Now that we've done this incorrectly, let's go ahead and do this correctly. Let's see what the good version looks like. So I'm going to bring the good formula back here, right? So just so you can compare the two, I'm going to leave it up this time. So let's start working through this good version, okay? The good version starts in exactly the same way. So we're going to max X the customers table with this expression right here. So go get the customers table, add this column to it, and then max it. Take the max of those values. Okay, so we got to get the customers table. Consider the filter context once again, because it's this cell right here, countries equal to USA, is automatically populated in the filter context on the onset. So we say, okay, let's get the customer table. That's over here. But we only want the customer table respecting the current filter context. So that's customers country equals USA. Well, that's those values right there. So the rows that pass all those tests, well, there's only one test. So that's those rows right there. And that's what we end up bringing back. Those three rows we bring back to our customers table, right? That we're going to add this column to. Once again, exactly the same as before, and we're on the right track so far. Haven't hit any problems yet. Okay. So now that we've got the customers table, we're going to add a column to it, right? We're going to add sort of an X, an unnamed column. And the column is going to be defined as this right here, which is sort of the same thing as this right here. And this is exactly the same as this, except this has a calculate wrapped around the whole thing, and that is going to make all the difference. So let's consider what happens when we start adding values to this column. So again, we're going to call three tables, right? One for each one of these rows, or cells, if you want to think of them that way. So let's start thinking about this one right here. Okay, well, we're going to execute this in this row context, okay? But we start with we've got this filter context of custom country equals USA. That's what it is just on this start, because we're in this cell, which is affected by this sort of, I guess you call it a member, right? This, USA right there. But because we've got calculate wrapped around this whole thing, calculate's going to activate context transition. So without asking, calculate is going to add whatever's in the current row context to the current filter context, okay? So this isn't actually the final filter context we're going to use here in a second. First, calculate's going to add these values to it, just like that. So now the filter context has, what it had before. It's also got customer name equals and I've sort of added customer country equals USA just to make it really clear. You might say, well, wait a minute, does it have customer country equals USA twice? The short answer is, at this point in your learning, whichever one's easier to remember is the correct answer, right? So yeah, just think about it as just adding them all, right? That's sort of the easiest way to think about it. So now we've got this new filter context that has had context transition sort of happen, which has promoted these values up into the current filter context, right? For the purposes of grabbing this sales table. So now that we've got this filter context, let's think about grabbing the sales table, right? This is going to be different than last time because, here's the row context last time. Here's the row context this time. It's got these new values in it, right? So we've got the sale table, right? So just like before, we had this filter on customer country equals USA. Well, there's all those values, but we've also got a filter on customer name equals and. Well, there's only one actual row that has that to be accurate. So we're going to bring back the rows that pass all the tests, and there's actually only one row that passes all the tests. These rows, pass one, but not both of the tests. This is the only row that passes all tests. So we're going to bring back that row. So when we grab the sales table here, because we're in this filter context, we're going to get this table right here. Okay, so now that we've got this table, we're going to go ahead and add a column to it, right? Same as before. Sale amount plus 0, right? That's going to be, the expression that populates this sort of unnamed column. And we're going to say, okay, well, sale amount plus 0, 6 plus 0 equals 6, and the sum of, well, just 6 is equal to 6. This is fantastic, though. This is exactly what we want, because now the sale table is not just these sales for all USA customers, which is what we had over here. This is the sale table for, USA, and more importantly, USA and AN. That's actually more specifically what we want. So this is AN sales. So this 6 actually represents all the sales for AN. So we bring the 6 value back there. Boom. Okay, AN sales is 6. That's correct because of this context transition. So let's do it again, right? So we're going to think about getting this value right there. And we're starting off in this row context. So we'll consider the filter context. Well, coming into it, again, we start by only having a filter on customer country equals USA. But because this sales call is inside of this calculate function, we're going to promote the row context to filter context. That's what context transition is. Again, without asking, calculate adds whatever's in the current row context to the current filter context. So these values are going to get added to the filter context, just like that. Okay, very cool. So now when we go ahead and get the sale table, right? Go get the sale table, add this column to it. When we get the sale table, right, we're going to get it looking through the lens of this filter context, right? This filter context post-context transition. So let's look at the sale table. Okay, now we've got two filters, customer country equals USA, as always, and now customer name equals Han. Well, there's only two rows where that's the case, so we want the rows that pass all the tests, and that's those rows right there. So we're going to bring those rows back, and here is our sale table that we're going to add this expression to as a column X, right, and sum it up. So now we've got all the sales for Han in the USA. Let's go ahead and add the X column. X column is defined as sale amount plus 0. Let's go ahead and start populating those values. So for the first one, well, sale amount is, in this row context, 8 plus 0. That's 8. And in this row context, for that value right there, 4 plus 0 is equal to 4. See, 4. And what we end up with is 8 plus 4 is equal to 12, which is perfect. That is actually, 12 is the sales for Han. And we're going to bring that value back there. This is great. We're on the right track here. Okay, do it one more time. So we're going to think about this sort of last cell right there. When we start to evaluate it, we're going to go, we're going to get the sales table and add this expression to it, but it's inside of this calculate, right? So start by considering the filter context. It starts with just customer country equals USA, but because we've got this calculate surrounding, this whole thing here, when we call sales table, since it's inside the calculate, we're going to promote the row context to the filter context. So we've got calculate there, so calculate's going to take these two values and stick them right there. Okay, now the filter context has both USA like it had before, but it's also got the customer name equals Jorge. So when we go get the sales table, it's going to be under this filter context, right? Sale table, and it's going to play out like this. So now we're going to look at, again, customer country equals USA, same as always, and now customer name equals Jorge. Well, that's only that row right there, so we only want the rows that pass both tests, or all the tests. So we look at that row, and that row is what we're going to bring back, boom, right there, okay? So now we've got the sales table under this filter context. Let's add this column to it, and when we're all done, we'll sum it up. Okay, so we're going to add X. X is defined as sale amount plus 0, right? Well, there's only one row. So in this particular cell, if you want to think of it like a cell, we're in this row context, so we get sale amount is equal to 5. 5 plus 0 is equal to 5. Okay, well, we add up all the values in this column. Well, there's only one value. That's going to be equal to 5, which is actually correct. That is the sales for Jorge. We're going to bring that back there. Okay, so now we've got, for each one of these customers, that customer's actual total sales, which is correct. So in a second, we're going to take the max of this column right here, and what we're going to end up with is the maximum sales for, or we're going to end up with the sales for our top customer, which is Han right there, right? So 12 is bigger than 6 and 5, so we take the max, and we get 12. And hence, 12 is actually the total sales for our top selling customer, which is Han right there. So that matches that. And that is how this works correctly. So this entire thing, even though the only difference between this formula and this formula is this calculate here, that calculate is going to force context transition, which means when we call this sales table, it's going to go ahead and respect what row it's in, right? It's going to respect the customer's name, which is exactly what we want, okay? So let's add a little bit of a definition. This isn't quite a definition. This is sort of an implication right here. Without context transition, aka in this sense, when you don't use calculate, within a cell's calculation, any table call ignores the other value in that cell's row. So if we call the sales table here, it doesn't care about if it's, Han or Ann or Jorge or anything like that. It only cares about whatever's in the current filter context. By contrast, with context transition, aka when you use calculate, within a given cell's calculation, any table call does get filtered by the other value in that cell's row. So if I call a sales table here and I use calculate, that forces context transition, so both Ann and USA get pushed into the filter context. Han and USA get pushed into the filter context. So when you get the sales table, you actually get the sales table for Ann or the sales table for Han, like you would want. Okay, great. So if this is the first time you're looking at this video, at this point I would stop. We're going to look at a few more small implications or things about this, and you've probably got more information than you already need. So I would just, stop, hit stop, go away, digest this for a little while, maybe rewatch this video next week. If this is your second time through, let's go look at a few other small things. Okay, so let's clear all that stuff out. Let's look at these expressions right here, or these measures right here. So these things, as we've already seen like many times, they're exactly the same except for here in argument 2, we've got the whole thing wrapped around, a calculate wrapped around the whole thing, right? So let's ask a question. Let's create this measure called total sales, right? And total sales is just sum x sales, sale amount plus 0. And that is the same thing as that right there and this right here inside the calculate, okay? Now, let's create this new measure. We're going to call it not ugly, right? Because we've got the good, the bad, and it's not really ugly, so I'm going to call this the good, the bad, and the not ugly. And this expression is a max x of the customer sales, right? And then we've got this total sales measure, so it calls this measure right here. Well, this measure right here, the expression inside of it looks the same as this right here. So my question to you is, does it behave exactly the same as this measure or exactly the same as this measure? And as you might be guessing, this is kind of a trick question. You would think, because this is the same thing as this, that this would behave exactly like this was, and that's actually not correct. So let's break this out even more, just to make it even really simpler. What I'm really sort of asking here is, does this measure call right here, does it equal this, or does it equal this? You would think it equals this, but maybe it doesn't. So again, make it really clear. Those are sort of, that expression is equal to that or equal to that. So to understand this, to understand why this is sort of a trick question, we have to understand the idea of this implicit calculate. So implicit calculate is it's a fairly simple concept, and it's hard to keep in mind, but you should learn to do it. So implicit calculate, you can sort of think of it as follows. Without asking, all measure definitions are wrapped inside of a calculate, right? So whenever you define a measure, or maybe you could think of it as whenever you call a measure, whatever you wrote here, it's actually going to get wrapped inside of a calculate, right? So said differently, whatever you write, you should imagine an extra calculate wrapped around the outside. I should capitalize that. So what it looks like is that right there. So even though you wrote this, the way you want to think about it is this, right? So you can't write a measure without there being this implicit calculate around the outside of it. So whatever you write, there's always a calculate, right? So what that means is that even though when we wrote it, this looked just like this, the fact is because of this implicit calculate, this total sales measure is actually more closely aligned to this calculate sum x sales, sale amount plus 0, right? So what that means is, when we ask our question is, the not ugly is the same as the bad or the good, the reality is it's actually the same as the good, okay? So, who cares? Well, there's a couple things to talk about here. It's important to remember that measures always are wrapped into calculate, so they always produce context transition. So if you write a measure, or maybe said otherwise, if you call a measure, there's no way to call that measure without producing context transition, okay? So if you use a measure as your definition of x inside of an x function, sum x or max x or anything like that, context transition always happens, like every single time, okay? So that's why if you're using a measure in an x function or as part of a calculated column, this is a very common scenario, it seems to magically work. So you might think, well, wait, why does, I write something that looks like this and it doesn't work. Then I write something that looks like this and it does work. It does work. Or if I just call a measure, it magically works. Well, that's the reason why. Is when you call the measure, even though you wrote something that looks like that, it's actually wrapped inside of a calculate. So there's always context transition. Okay. So if you don't want context transition, you cannot use a measure. Whenever you call a measure, it will always produce context transition. So if you don't want it, you can't use a measure, right? Filter is an iterator, right? Just like sum x or max x. You can think of it as filter x. Sometimes I think of it as filter x. So if you want to avoid context transition, don't use a measure or calculate. You can use variables instead. So what is the implication of this, right? This isn't a video about all this stuff. I just sort of wanted to bring this to your attention. Here's a very, I know we don't have a date table up here in our model, but let's just assume we do for a second. Here we've got some very simple measures where we've got last year's sales good, last year's sales bad, and last year's sales bad B, right? So last year's sales good, this is a pattern that you've probably seen before, where we do a calculate of the total sales, we do filter, oh man, I'm missing a parentheses there. We filter over the calendar table, right? So we go get the calendar table, and we say for each row in the calendar table, check to see if the calendar year is equal to the max calendar year outside of this all call of the calendar table. Which is to say, here we're checking row by row of the calendar table, and we want to see if the year is equal to the calendar year outside of this calendar table. Like, what is it in the cell that we called it in, right? And that works just fine, right? It works exactly the way you would want it to. You end up getting, all the sales for, oh, this should be -1. Boy, I kind of blew it here. Let's add -1 here. Let's add -1. Okay. All the sales for the current year -1. That's last year's sales. However, if we come down here, again, we're going to add our -1 there. We're going to see that even though this formula looks exactly the same, or looks very, very similar, because it's got this calculate wrapped around the expression that was right here, this calculate is going to force a context transition, which means when we go get the calendar table, we're not going to get the whole calendar table in the current filter context. We're going to get the calendar table, but only for the current row that we're in this iteration of the calendar table, right? So if we're looking at a certain date, like let's say November 11th, we're only going to get the year of November 11th, and it's going to cause it to break. Same thing here. When we've got this max calendar year, because it's a measure, it forces context transition, and that's going to break this formula. So this is not a deep dive into why these two things break, other than to say it's the context transition that is causing it, right? So if you have measures that look like this, you're wondering why they don't work, it's context transition. You're going to want to write the expression like that, or you can use variables to handle that. Okay. So maybe I'll do a longer video on that at some point to sort of make that a little bit more clear. Okay. But, I just wanted to bring it up. Okay, so there's that. One more thing that I would like to bring up is if we, rewind just a little bit to this situation right here where we're looking for the value in this cell. You might notice that there's a row context here for the sort of the table that we're in, but this whole table is kind of part of this row right here. So this cell, if you want to think of it as a cell, even though it's sort of part of this row context, it's also kind of part of this row context, isn't it? So you might be asking yourself, hey Brian, is there a way that I can write an expression such that I reach back outside of this sort of inner row context to an outer row context to get a value in the outer row context? And the answer is yes. Yes, there is. That is the whole point of the earlier functions and the earliest functions, is they allow you to, within a given expression or a calculation, reach back out, back from the current row context to an earlier row context, right? That's the whole idea behind earlier, okay? Now, if that doesn't make total sense, that's just fine right now. I'm just sort of introducing you to the idea. That way, hopefully, later on when you read about it, it'll maybe make quite a bit more sense. All right, well, that is enough of that. I'd just like to say, once again, thank you for watching. I really hope you learned a lot and had a good time. And I guess I will see you next time.